Jay McInerney summed up coming of age in the mid-decade with his acclaimed first novel, Bright Lights, Big City. Now he tells the story of what happens when the golden youth of the 80s face the limitations of adulthood in the 90s with his new novel, Brightness Fails. Brightness Falls. It is not fails, Brightness Falls. It is different. I mean, first of all, welcome. It's nice to have you here.
Thanks, Charlie.
Your story is as interesting as this story, and this is an interesting story. Tell me how this is different than the three earlier novels.
Well, I think my three earlier books are really about whatever the chronological age of the characters in those books. They are adolescents, essentially. They are people standing on the brink of adult society. They're looking in, they have the social contract in front of them, and they're saying, why should I sign? This doesn't look so great. My new book is about characters who really are in the middle of something like adult life. They not only have jobs, but they have relationships. They not only have jobs but careers. They not only have relationships, they have marriages. And suddenly they're finding that the decisions they made in their 20s are hardening around them and defining and limiting the choices available to them in their 30s.
Is it part of you summing up the 80s?
Yeah, it is a book. I think of it as an epitaph for the 80s. I started writing it in '88, but already it seemed to me that there was, the stock market crash had taken place at that time. Restaurants were starting to close.
This is set in 1987, before the market crash.
It's set in '87, but it is really about the end of the party that was the 80s. The era of excess and consumption and greed and I have to say that there was an excitement in that period which is also gone now. It's easy to make fun of that time, and it's easy to say what's wrong with it, and I think that that's part of my function as a novelist. But it was also a very heady time, a very giddy time, and I think my first book, Bright Lights, Big City, was something of the story of the beginning of that time. This is a bookend to that.
Tell me about what it was like for you having, and you've talked about this at length in a lot of places, including with me on other broadcasts, but what you wrote about in Bright Lights actually happened to you in a sense. I mean, the sense of experiencing the explosion came to you after you'd written the book.
Yeah, it was very funny. I wrote Bright Lights as a kind of is the story of what I saw as the beginning of this era of exuberance, and whatever your politics are, mine happen to be rather liberal, but the 80s, particularly in New York, was a time of, there was a sense of great promise in the air, of great possibilities, of a dawn, of a sense of infinite possibilities. And in a funny way, when I wrote Bright Lights, Big City, I was very much an outsider to the city. I was an outsider to this scene. I really was almost guessing about what I was writing about. And the funny thing was, I was really invited into that party after I wrote the book.
But the book was viewed as defining the era.
Well, I really didn't. I certainly didn't think of it that way myself. I happened to be placed, I guess, as a young man coming to New York, in a position where I happened to be there when the curtain came up, and I wrote what I thought was, to some extent, the story of my life and the world around me. It just seemed to coincide with the dawn of this era. I certainly wasn't planning to write the book about the zeitgeist of the 80s.
And what it did for you is incredible. I mean, all of a sudden...
good and bad.
For good and bad. And we'll get to that in terms of this book as to whether it is, in fact, something coming back for you. It was extraordinary in terms, to go back and read how you were portrayed. I mean, you became, what? Characterize it for me. After the success. I mean, a book that sold 700,000 copies and still sells 30,000 copies a year, which is stunning to me.
Well,
And happy for you.
No, that part is very happy to me. What wasn't so happy was that, without my realizing it, at first we were so thrilled to have any kind of attention. I remember the publicist of Random House coming to me and saying, guess what, we finally got you some publicity. This was right before the book came out.
We found a show that'll take you.
No, they said, you can be the Cosmo Bachelor of the Month. And I said, I'm sorry, but I just got married. And so that was the end of that. And really, the book came out. There was no publicity. So when the first interview, when the first photo session came along, I was so thrilled to participate. I was so thrilled to talk about my book. as each successive interview or photo op came along, I was very excited to try and attract new readers. And suddenly, after about a year of this, I discovered that I'd created a monster. You know,
And the monster was?
The monster was my alter ego. The monster was the man who was still seen, who was still portrayed in every magazine and newspaper in New York long after I had gone to Dorset, Vermont for 3 months to write this book. The pictures of me continued to appear, Jay McInerney at this party, Jay McInerney at that party. They were all recycled, of course, but I found that I had created an image that I couldn't even stop.
And do you think the reception of the 2 books after that, which was not very good,
Indeed,
was in fact because they were just bad books, or because people just didn't like what you had become?
Gosh, let me think hard about it. No, I'm very proud of my second and third books, and I was a little surprised at the relatively negative reception to those books. I was a little astounded at what I refer to as the malice of strangers, and I finally had to attribute some of it to a kind of a backlash against the perceived success of my first book.
The persona that had been created because of the success.
And to a reaction of what was taken to be my persona, my personality.
Taken to be, but not true?
Well,
I mean,
if I were living the kind of life which I sometimes have been portrayed as living, then indeed I don't think that I would have written those second.
Yeah,
and third
well,
books.
but you don't make any. I mean, you have written about the drugs and the parties, and I mean, you have.
I was along for that ride. And
Yeah.
I've never been coy about it, and I think that if I had a spin doctor, which God knows I don't have, that spin doctor might have said to me, shut up, Jay, and don't be honest, don't be.
Never acknowledge.
Don't be forthright about anything that you've ever done. I'm always intrigued when people say, "Gee, who's your publicist?" You're always in the papers.
Yeah.
In fact, if I had a publicist, the
publicist would have said, "Get the hell out of the papers."
It would be somebody who kept me out of the papers. Yeah, yeah, I think I probably made a mistake from a tactical point of view in terms of not withdrawing sooner, but there was no map for me out there. This had not happened to another novelist
in 20 or 30 years.
Yeah, and certainly not in the '80s in this new superheated media climate.
Who was the last novelist for it to happen to, would you say?
Well, I don't want to compare myself to my betters, but certainly somebody that I've consulted for advice on this process is Norman Mailer. It seems like in his generation, people like Mailer, Vidal, were adopted by by television, this brand new medium.
And Mailer
were taken up by the gossip columns. Their personal life was looked into, and I don't think that it had happened for very often.
That's right. Each generation needs its novelist, and we didn't. And my generation didn't have one. I don't think. I mean, Mailer was the last one to be so celebrated.
Well, there was a time there when the novel really
that kind of lifestyle
slipped out of fashion. Certainly in the '60s, everybody, Truman Capote's In Cold Blood,
right.
Mailer's nonfiction books. Tom Wolfe declared the novel dead, before he became more famous by
writing
writing
Bonfire.
one himself.
Right.
But there was a period there when the novel seemed almost to be dead, and certainly when I published my first novel, the last thing I thought was that it would gather a lot of attention and make me some kind of celebrity.
Was there that enormous pressure on you in your own mind to make this a success? Because it's been, the reviews I've read, including today in the New York Times, are complimentary. How much, I mean, you must feel a certain sense of those people who said, McInerney had one good book in him and he's already written it, and it was Bright Lights, and therefore you had 2 failures, and people said, we told you. As you said, the words they used were like fluke, that the first book was a fluke. And all of a sudden you come back now and you're getting a lot of praise. Is there a sense on you of, I told you so, I told you that it...
Well, I'm very grateful for the favorable response to this book, and I don't take it lightly at all. At the same time, I refuse to disbelieve in my last 2 books, just because they were somewhat damned by, in a number of fairly predictable quarters, in fairly predictable ways. The reviews of my last 2 books seemed to me to be more about what was imagined to be my life than indeed about what I had actually written. Nevertheless, I set myself what I think was a very big task with this book. I wanted to write about love and work, marriage and friendship, and I also wanted to try and sum up an era if I could. And I'm glad that the effort seems to be somewhat appreciated.
And to those people who say they see a lot of figures in the publishing world in this book, do you say yes, that's true?
There are several characters in the book who originated with models here in our world, the New York literary publishing media world. On the other hand, I'm fascinated by this guessing game. I think people in New York are going to have a much easier time reading this book because they won't be distracted by this game. A Vanity Fair writer went so far as to propose that the protagonist of the book, who was my editor, because Russell Calloway has long blonde hair, and so does my editor. Well, in fact, nowhere in the book is Russell Calloway described as having long blonde hair, and this is how far you can be led astray.
And others say that Jeff is you.
Well, Jeff Pierce is a writer with a very different biography from me. On the other hand, he does have an early success which turns sour on him, and I know a lot about that, so I drew from myself.
You now live in Nashville. You recently married at the end of 1991, and live in Nashville. And you wrote that, or recently I saw something where you said that you come back to New York now, and it doesn't seem to have the energy that it did have.
Well, I suppose if the energy were here as it were, I would be afraid to miss anything. In fact, I divide my time now between New York and Nashville. I think really that there's no question. Brightness Falls is set just 5 years ago, and yet already it seems like a historical period. I read recently that some 3,000–4,000 restaurants have closed in the last 3 years, just to take one silly example. How many stretch limousines do you see on the street? These are not gauges necessarily of moral worth, but there's no question that I think a lot of the vitality and exuberance, even the craziness that was New York in the 80s has dissipated. I'm not sure that that's a bad thing. On the other hand, I think what we have now is a kind of negative zeitgeist. Whatever the 90s are about, it seems so far mainly to be a reaction to this very, very powerful
excessiveness of the
period, which was the 80s.
Yeah. I want to ask you this, and I only have about 30 seconds. None of this would have been possible without Raymond Carver?
Raymond Carver, the great short story writer, who's
late Raymond Carver,
sadly deceased now. I met him in New York many years ago. He was somebody who, for some reason, believed in me at a time when I was at a very low point in my life, and said, "Get out of New York. Come study with me. I'll show you how to be a writer." And yeah, really, actually, that was the turning point in my life as a writer. I owe it all to him.
Brightness Falls, a new novel by Jay McInerney. Thanks for coming. Come back anytime. Pleasure. We'll be right back. Stay with us.